I'm glad to be joined by Diana Mutz, Samuel A. Stauffer Professor of Political Science and Communication from the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Mutz, what a pleasure to see you after reading your work for years.
Thank you very much. A pleasure to be here.
A federal trade court on Wednesday blocked President Donald Trump from imposing sweeping tariffs to imports under an emergency powers law. So while you are doing this research about American public's perception about foreign trade, we see the so-called internal negotiation and massaging, quote unquote, about policies are also taking place. How do you understand this process? How are you concerned or are you optimistic?
Well, I have to be optimistic, but one of the things that most ordinary Americans didn't know about this statute from the 1700s that, allows the president to have more power if we're under attack. And you understand why that particular statute is there. But the question is, do Americans really think that's what's going on in this country? No, they don't. We know they don't. And the idea that this is an emergency right now really is a very hard argument to make. We've had many situations that came a lot closer than that that did not allow such strong executive power.
Since your book came out, Losers and Winners of Foreign Trade, you argue specifically what has been going through people's mind when it comes to trade and decision related to trade is not necessarily just economics and trade, but something else. Tell us more about that.
So traditionally, the way trade attitudes had been studied in the US, people thought people were essentially choosing trade policies based on whether it helped them or hurt them personally. And what we found in our research is that that wasn't the case. In fact, very few people had a sense of how they were affected financially by trade. It's not an easy issue. It's very complicated. And we would ask people based on their occupations, the companies they worked for, if they thought they benefited, did their company export, import. They did no better than chance at knowing the kind of information that they would need in order to know if they were favorably or unfavorably affected. I actually chose for my book's title not to call it The Psychology of International Trade, but rather Foreign Trade. And I did that for a reason, because foreign has a connotation that international does not. Things that are new, different, and unfamiliar to people, people fear.
Very interesting. So how has that mentality about trade, which is from a globalized world, then everybody feel like they're benefiting from this, and they are, to now, it seems that very fragmented views about trade?
Well, one of the things that's interesting is that that impression that you have is very much the impression many people have, that the public has turned against trade, but actually we don't see that in our data. We do see that their perception of the American public is that it has turned against trade. And the whole phrase that you see so often in the media, the backlash against globalization, that phrase really wasn't common at all in the news until Trump won the first time. After the 2016 election, many people attributed his win to a backlash against globalization because he was very anti-globalization in his campaign. And they infer that, oh, well, he won and he was anti-globalization, so the public must be this. In reality, people vote based on a mix of things, not any one issue like that. But what Trump did do that benefited his race in 2016 is that in 2012, you would find no difference between where the public saw Republicans and Democrats on trade. Absolutely none. And the public was kind of right in the middle on it. They really didn't have strong opinions. If anything, they were suspicious of trade. And if you saw our media coverage, you might understand why that is, because regardless of whether a source is a liberal or conservative source, the storyline, the narrative was typically, oh, they are stealing our jobs. So It was one of lack of fairness, that kind of feeling. So the public was much more anti-trade than political elites were.
You are arguing actually individual feelings about how trade is impacting on their lives is quite different from the eventual now what you call the public perception about trade in America.
Right. We ask people, in addition to asking them their own views on trade, we also ask them what direction has public opinion been moving on this issue. And overwhelmingly on both trade and immigration, long before Trump was elected a second time, people said the winds of public opinion were turning against globalization. And that was a very strong theme in all news coverage during the Biden administration. When you ask people how their own families, their own lives are affected by trade, this may have changed in the last 3 months. I can't be sure because the last data I collected was at the end of last year. But overwhelmingly, the most common answer is, I'm not affected by trade. Well, they are, but they're just not aware because it's very complicated. However, the collective well-being of the United States, they do feel is affected by it. And mostly coverage before, Trump was elected the first time, it was all pretty negative. It was all about bad things that happened due to trade.
But one could argue similar things are happening in different parts of the world. Why is the United States in such a unique way now starting a tariff war against the rest of the world?
I don't think it's unique, but I also don't think it's the same. So, for example, I've studied this in other countries as well, Canada, Great Britain. Basically, a lot of countries had similar things going on, and people started to call this one huge backlash against globalization. But if you look at public opinion, for example, in Great Britain, they were very, very pro-trade. Even people who were pro-Brexit were very pro-trade. So it's not the case that it was the same as what was going on in the United States that way. They just didn't want Brussels to control trade. They wanted to be able to control it themselves, but they were not anti-trade in the same way that you see. However, the whole idea that Trump has promoted, which is not that the U.S. is a world leader, but rather we're being taken advantage of, that is something that I think hits people because they think, what? They're taking advantage of us? It's not that they have enough information to know what these agreements are like, but the sense that somehow we should be dominating, but we're not, is something that does, I think, get to voters.
How did it come into a shared belief that we, quote unquote, should be dominating? And we, quote unquote, should be the winner of all time at anything. If not, then let's just throw it away without thinking about how much I have to suffer myself as well.
So it's a very, very interesting issue. When I compare trade attitudes in the United States and Canada, for example, looking at the very same trade agreement, Canadians are far more positive when both sides win. And after all, that's what trade is supposed to be about, mutual cooperation for mutual benefit. But somehow that has been promoted through a frame of competition in the United States. And that's why I called my book Winners and Losers, because the whole idea is we're supposed to all benefit. But even when you give conservative Americans a trade agreement where the U.S. clearly benefits, and so does the trading partner, they are not okay with it. And they want, the U.S. to gain and the other side to lose. And I think it may be partly a function of being a large and economically dominant country. People come to think that's how things, really ought to be for whatever reason. But I also think it has a lot to do with suggesting this idea to the public. Trump was the first person who did that. Before Trump, both Democrats and Republicans were pretty pro-trade. They voted that way in Congress, even if they didn't necessarily tell their constituents that's what they supported. What we've really seen is a polarization. We've seen Democrats and Republicans move further apart on these issues. We have a lot of coverage of jobs lost, and that we were talking earlier about emotion. That's something very emotional. Hearing even about one person who's lost their job when it's attributed to trade, it makes people angry. Interestingly, even though far more jobs in the US are lost due to automation, when we give people a story about a person losing their job to automation, it doesn't bother them.
I know there are certain people in the academic circle and certainly beyond have been trying to argue against you in a very strong way, suggesting your numbers are not correct, you have not done your research, all the fake people, fake research, and the list that goes on. But I see you're holding on very firmly to your academic belief. Tell me more about, in such a fragmented environment, how do scholars like you hold on to the research that you think are crucial for the future of your country and your people?
I think that when you're a scholar who does empirical research like I do, you very much learn from what you're doing. My specialty is listening to the American people and trying to understand what they are saying. And if they were saying something very different, I would be saying something very different about how the public feels about things as well. So certainly there's political disagreement out there, but actually among academics, especially among economists, they are overwhelmingly pro-trade. They are not heavily divided at all. Nonetheless, their understanding of how the public forms views don't seem to be the actual way it comes about. And that's really my contribution, is to say, people are thinking about it as if this were a sports match and there's a winner and a loser. And that is not really what trade is about. When people try to think about trade internationally, it's very difficult for them, given that they're not economists themselves. But they think of it as a one-to-one exchange. The idea being that you give us something and we give you something. But trade is so much more than that, because trade has allowed the international economy to grow tremendously. That's not a story that's actually been told a lot in the media. And I think the bigger story is about inequality within the US here. But internationally, it's a story about reduced inequality.
Thursday morning Beijing time, Wednesday evening US time, we have seen some new immediate release coming from the State Department of the United States talking about, here I quote, put America first and not China, but mainly what it's talking about is to aggressively revoke visas for Chinese students, including those with connections to the Chinese Communist Party or studying in critical fields. Also, revise visa criteria to enhance scrutiny of all future visa applications coming from China and also China's Hong Kong, end of quote. So, as an educator, how do you see these latest administrative measures and its possible consequences?
Education has been one of our greatest exports in the United States. Many international students come to the US to study. Many of them help run our labs as postdocs and graduate students. So our universities stand to lose huge amounts of our incomes from a loss of international students. We already see that now. Fewer people are applying, and more of our PhDs are applying to jobs in other countries. International students feeling like they aren't welcome in the United States, that it's not a good idea to come to the US to go to school or for postdoctoral training or whatever the particular situation might be. We need them as part of our workforce, as part of our research teams, and so forth. But in addition to that, it's just changed our universities have all completely changed their budgets in the last 3 months, because a huge amount of our income comes from grant overhead. All those grants have been canceled from the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, and so forth. So we are hemorrhaging, funding, will pull through, but I do think that even if things turn around, there is going to be this lingering sense that in other countries we can't trust America. We don't know, who they're going to elect and whether they will be as interested in this mutual relationship.
Professor, as we speak on Thursday, the 29th of May, we understand there is a hearing going on in the United States about the latest, shall I say, tug of war between Harvard University and the US government.
I think they need to understand how much our international community on campus enriches American students' experience of education. It's extremely valuable, and it's also valuable to the United States as a country when students who are from other countries educated here go back to their home countries. It is important to have this mixing and melding of ideas and perspectives for a really high class education. And we are all hoping that Harvard succeeds. Obviously, Harvard is one of the wealthiest universities in terms of its endowment. So the hope is that if they are successful, that the Trump administration will back off from these plans. But all of us have had to prepare for the fact that that might not be the case. So we've scaled back all of our programs.
What does that mean to you personally when you say scale back your programs?
Well, we're all very aware that we're being recruited by other countries these days. Just as World War II was a great thing for United States academic culture because we basically hired away all of these great minds from Germany. Other countries are attempting to do that with the US now. And I have talked to several of them, so they're well aware that our jobs are not what they used to be. In terms of my day-to-day life, I have a wonderful group of graduate students called the Institute for the Study of Citizens and Politics. Mm-hmm. They help me with my research. I could not be nearly as productive without them. Mm-hmm. And then they go on and teach at other universities all over the world. So I have academic children and grandchildren, but it's also, I taught a course, I have to tell you about on globalization attitudes to some of our undergrads at Penn a couple years ago. And it was fascinating to me how they thought about globalization. And the truth is, they hadn't thought about it much at all. And nor had they thought about the movement of people across borders and why that happens and who gains and so forth from that. So I think it's great that we're talking about globalization so much more than we used to. It used to be something that, political elites might talk about, but not everyday people. But now they are.